So today, indeed, I'm going to be presenting some insights from a focus group study on research integrity and education and training. And this is from an article that I'm working together with our partners in the Sub-Saharan project. So to begin with, I'm just going to say something about the project. So it's funded by the European Commission, Horizon 2020 Framework Program, and our goal is to develop a publicly available toolbox which will contain guidelines for research integrity targeted at the level of the research institutions. But why are we doing this? Well, we see, for instance, in the ALEA Code that there's agreement that research institutions have a responsibility to foster research integrity. And while there are aspirational guidance documents, such as the ALEA Code or the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Research Integrity available, there's little concrete guidance available on how to translate aspirational values into actual practices and policies. In the Sub-Saharan project, we've identified a number of topics we would like to include in our toolbox, and you can see these here. And after identifying them, we conducted focus groups earlier this year with researchers and other research stakeholders across Europe to obtain in-depth qualitative data on different disciplines' understandings of the needs for guidelines for research integrity. So the disciplinary component was very important here. And we also wanted to explore what challenges and barriers exist for these guidelines on the various topics, and also to look at some best practices and solutions. So in this presentation, I'm going to be specifically focusing on the material from these focus groups that were about education and training. And for this, the question is why should we look into this? And what we saw is that if you look at the literature, there is absolute consensus that one of the most important ways to foster research integrity for research institutions is to offer research integrity training in education. And actually, there are many programs available globally and also in Europe. And the interesting thing is that they all use different approaches, different methods, different ways of evaluating the trainings. So there's a lot of fragmentation. And at the same time, there's little guidance available to institutions on how to set up comprehensive research integrity training programs. And there's also little empirical evidence, especially in the European context, on how to do this. So that's why we wanted to explore what policies research institutions can implement to provide good research integrity education and training, but also how they can make the implementation successful according to the stakeholders we consulted in our focus groups. So for the overall Sub-Saharan focus groups, we did 30 focus group studies across Europe, and each focus group was focused on a specific discipline. So 8 focus groups were with people from the natural sciences, 8 from the medical sciences, and then 7 from the social sciences and 7 from the humanities. And 14 of the focus groups contained participants who were researchers of various ranks. So we tried to include at least some senior and some junior researchers in these. But then in the other 16 focus groups, we also included other research stakeholders such as funders, research integrity officers, confidential counselors, and others. And you can find, if you're interested in our methods in more detail, you can find our full study protocol on OSF. So of these 30 focus groups, 8 of them explicitly address the topic of research education and training. And in these focus groups, we asked our participants what measures or policies or infrastructures they think research institutions should implement to deliver good research integrity trainings, and what the barriers and facilitators to these are. And then while the other focus groups, the other 22, did not explicitly address this topic, a lot of relevant insights still came up about research integrity, education, and training from these, so we also included relevant insights from the other 22. To analyze our data, we used a mixed deductive, inductive, thematic analysis. So what we did first was we looked at some material we had obtained from earlier stages of the project, containing best practice documents on research integrity. And of these, we identified 67, which were relevant for research integrity, education, and training. And we analyzed them to come up with a set of deductive codes which would guide our analysis. And the deductive codes were about target group, training goals, approach, and content, incentives, training organization, and implementation factors. After this, we did 2 rounds of coding. In the first round, we went through all the transcripts and added inductive codes as well as coding with the deductive codes. And in the second round of coding, using independent coder, we saw whether there were any discrepancies, and we discussed them to come up with the overarching themes and sub-themes. In our findings, you can see that we came up with 5 overarching themes. So the first was that our participants stated that the research integrity training should target all researchers and research support staff. The second was that trainings could focus on different goals and content depending on the context and target group of the training. The third is that training should be made attractive to the trainees to incentivize participation. The fourth was that training should be organized continuously and using informal and formal approaches. And the last one was that education and training both influences, but also is influenced by cultural factors and the system of science. So I'll dive in a bit deeper into each of these themes. So to begin with, the target groups. So our participants mentioned that training should start as early as possible, maybe even at the bachelor or master level, but that it would also be important to include more senior researchers also in trainings, although that could be more difficult because it's done less often at the moment, but that it was still very important to include them. And some participants also highlighted the importance of including not only researchers, but other research support staff in the trainings because they're also part of the research system. So one of our participants, for instance, explained why it's important to include also the seniors. So it was a research integrity teacher from the Netherlands who said, but if I teach PhD students and tell them this is how to do things right, this is how to do things in a responsible way, then they go back to the labs where the norms are different and where they have to sort of fight against supervisors who are doing things the way they've always done them, which is fine because they just learned it that way. But now there are new insights, new cultures to create, but then the PhD students have to do all the work. So I think it's very important when you think about education to make sure you include all levels. And then the quote below shows the importance of including also not just researchers, but other research staff. So one researcher from Croatia said, and also for this decision makers or the deans, for the rectors, there should also be something written because they're ruling, they have a large responsibility. If they fail, then they can create large problems. So that's it about the target group. Then the next thing we looked at was the training goals, approach, and content. And as you can see on this slide, our participants mentioned a variety of different training goals and approaches, such as trainings focused on empowering researchers and supporting them with a hierarchy that's present in the system of research, or inspiring researchers and helping them to internalize research integrity principles. Some stress the importance of addressing the daily struggles and gray areas that researchers face. Others highlighted the importance of promoting a culture of integrity and reflection, so a way to build more responsible culture using trainings. But then there were also those who stressed that it's still important to address research misbehaviors and that knowledge of rules, norms, and regulations should also be addressed. So I think the important thing here is that different participants mentioned various goals, approaches, and content, and there was they were accentuated, some were accentuated as being more appropriate in certain settings than others. So to show you what I mean, you can see here that a researcher in the Netherlands said, but maybe just to comment on the discussion about power dynamics, I think it would be good then to just make PhD students aware really from the very start what the guidelines are and what their options are, to empower them from the beginning before they start publishing. So maybe some education or training in that regard would be helpful. So this suggests that empowerment could especially be helpful for the more junior researchers. And then a privacy officer, also in the Netherlands, said, and if you ask researchers ultimately in the end, like, what is your goal? What are you doing this for? And if their answer would be like, I want to improve healthcare, then it is far more easier to say, but what types of behavior are in line with that goal? And they also realize then that it is not a black and white thing, but I think you always have the connection with the outside world and why you're doing what you're doing. So here it's stressed that focusing on internalizing research integrity and also on the actual daily practice of research could be helpful. And if we looked across the disciplines, although there was still a lot of similarities, we also saw that certain types of approaches were more preferable for certain disciplines. So for instance, in the humanities, they really stressed the importance of focusing on building a culture of research integrity and internalizing it. Whereas in the medical sciences, the focus on rules was much more accepted. In the natural sciences, the participants actually thought that it would be helpful to focus on research misconduct, but also the gray areas, so to look at both there. And in the social sciences, it was similar in that participants stressed the importance of focusing on gray areas, but also on building a more responsible culture through trainings. Similarly, if we would look at the course content, a lot of the same issues came up. So for instance, authorship was one of the topics that in almost every focus group was highlighted as important to cover in trainings. But there were some slight differences. So in the humanities, they also stressed that plagiarism was important to cover. And in the natural sciences, there was also a lot of emphasis on lab work, whereas in the medical sciences, they really also emphasized covering ethics issues and issues of confidentiality. Then there was also a lot of discussion about how can you incentivize trainings. And there were a lot of ideas about this. So the first was that incentives are not enough and that the trainings themselves need to actually be attractive in order to get researchers to come. And this means actually addressing the needs of the researchers during the training, so also tailoring the content to what the target group will want. There was also the suggestion to actually integrate trainings into other existing structure, so maybe existing courses or into yearly evaluations or funding schemes even. Especially for the senior researchers, this was thought to be helpful. And then some also said that it would be helpful to have some trainings which are compulsory, but there was also more. There was also some disagreement about this, especially if you look at the senior researchers, because it would just become another burden on top of everything else they have to do. So one participant from Belgium, a research director, said, "In my experience, I have the feeling if you give a course about research integrity, that sometimes it's very difficult to indeed attract researchers because of different reasons. But also because they don't need it in a sense that they think, oh, but I don't do anything wrong in my research, so why should I go to a course? But if you focus more on specific topics where they're really, in their daily practice, they have issues with it, I think it's easier to attract them. And then we had a research integrity teacher in the Netherlands saying, I think it should just be in the existing things that are in place, like existing forms, the whole fabric of the science that we do. We have a yearly evaluation talk with our supervisor. Everybody has that, no matter your level, right? So also the dean, if that form, for instance, would say, what did you do this year to put quality over quantity, for instance, and you can give any example there, just make sure that you have some quality mark. Maybe just join the course or something like that. So these are two examples that show the importance of making sure that the trainings are attractive and that you provide the right incentives. Then our participants also discussed a lot of things about how to organize the courses. So one thing that was really emphasized is that doing one course is not enough. So training and education should be provided repeatedly in a researcher's career, and it should be provided in a disciplinary specific context. And then various methods were mentioned as being appropriate. So for instance, using discussions or case studies, but also it was mentioned that both online and offline approaches could be useful in different settings. But what really was interesting, which came out, was that doing just formal courses is not enough, especially for some groups. So in those cases, using informal means such as just open discussions, or even just counseling and advice on research integrity, or even just learning through doing, for instance, by submitting an ethics application, that those are also important ways to train research integrity. And then it was also highlighted that it's really important that teachers of research integrity are people who have experience with research. So you can see here that there was doubt about whether formal courses are always enough. So a senior researcher in Germany mentioned that not every part of research integrity can be trained in a training module or course, but has to be internalized by doing. We already discussed aspects of research integrity that relate to rules and regulations that can be learned, but not every aspect of research integrity can be trained explicitly. And similarly, a researcher from Croatia said, so I wanted to say that I think that one class or one course is not enough. If you look at the different disciplines, there were quite some interesting things with regard to the preferences for how the training should be organized. So interestingly, in the humanities, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for doing actual formal courses. And the participants said that having informalized sessions was much more helpful. On the other hand, in the medical sciences, there was acknowledgement that formal courses are helpful, but they also said that it could be good to integrate research integrity training also into other related topics. Similarly, in the natural sciences, there was also acceptance of having formal courses, but they really stressed the value of integrating those into more specific, for instance, data management courses or ethics issues courses, so that not all research integrity courses need to be provided as research integrity courses on their own, but aspects of it can be also integrated into other training programs. And in the social sciences, there was a preference for combining formalized and informalized approaches for a continuous education. So those were the themes that related to how to organize the courses. And then we also saw that with regard to implementation factors, various things were mentioned as having an influence on how the trainings, how successful the trainings can be. So for instance, if you look at mentorship or having a good research environment, the participants stated that these two elements played a crucial role in determining how successful trainings could be. But at the same time, they also stress that trainings can also improve mentorship and the research environment. So on the one hand, you need good mentorship and a good research environment to make sure that trainings are successful. But on the other hand, you can also use trainings as a tool to improve these. Then when it comes to rewards and incentive systems, participants stress that given the current situation, given the current way that reward and incentive systems are set up in science, this reduces training effectiveness. So they suggested that new reward and incentive systems could help trainings become more successful. And they also really emphasized the issue of not creating additional bureaucracy and oversight with training. So on the one hand, they said, well, in the past, maybe there was not so much attention for research integrity, so it's good if we have courses and if we have to do certain things that encourage us to think about research integrity. But on the other hand, there should also be trust in what we're doing, because otherwise, if there's no trust, then it can also make researchers more hesitant to actually internalize research integrity. And then also, the participants said that there's also individual factors of the trainees that are also important for implementation. So if you have certain researchers who have bad intentions to begin with, you can train them, but it's not going to have any effect. So just some quotes to illustrate what I explained. A research support manager in the Netherlands said, and creating an internal atmosphere where that doesn't help people go in that direction. So many PhDs may feel the only way for me to get this pressure off from my PI, or this constant, where's my nature paper, where's my science paper? Yeah, helping inform or train PIs of how to create an atmosphere that doesn't push people into that way. And then another research stakeholder, confidential counselor from the Netherlands, said, I think it also has to do with structures. If the structures are not good, then you can train as long as you like, but you're never going to change what is going to happen really in the grassroots. So given these findings, what can we conclude? Well, the first thing is that we see in the literature that when it comes to saying how successful trainings are, there's not a lot of evidence. And some people say that what would help is to really agree on a set training goal or set training goals to see then how to evaluate those training goals. But these findings show that maybe there's no need to agree on a set number of training goals or approaches, because different training goals and approaches will be needed in different settings. So these need to be tailored. Also, the study emphasizes the importance of thinking about how to incentivize and make trainings attractive. Providing the training, if people are not motivated to participate, is not going to be helpful. Also, here we show that informal training approaches, maybe that's not something that people often think about first when they think about education or training, but these are really important, especially in certain disciplines, for actually providing good trainings. And also, one-off training events are not enough. Training should be continuous. And also, there's different implementation factors involved, and we need much more research to understand the relationship between training and other elements of science that will have an influence on trainings. So I would just like to end with some recommendations to research institutions, because that's the kind of approach we have in the SOFS project, that we do this empirical work and then come up with some guidance. So the first thing is that research institutions should provide research integrity training to all researchers and research support staff. They should tailor the goals, approach, and content to the specific target group and disciplines of the training. That participation in training should be made attractive, and both formal and informal approaches to continuously teach about research integrity should be used. And that training is not enough, so it's important that research institutions also ensure a responsible institutional environment, good mentorship, a balance between trust and oversight, and contribute towards better reward and incentive systems in research. I also have some questions for you because a lot of you are research integrity trainers or your support staff. And I want to ask you, so how do you see the difference between education and training, considering that here I presented that you can use both formal and informal approaches in a continuous way. So what is training? What is education? Do we need to differentiate between the two? And then going back to the results, what are the implications of the results for your work? And regarding the recommendations, how feasible do you think these are? Thank you.